It's early morning in Halle, in the eastern German state of Sachsen-Anhalt, and Torsten is standing at his kitchen counter with a coffee going cold, staring at an energy bill that's 20% higher than it was 2 winters ago. He runs a small auto parts shop 3 blocks away, and the last few years have felt like running in place. Costs up, customers cautious, a federal government in Berlin that, from where he's standing, hasn't done much about either. This September, his state votes for a new government, and for the first time in his life, the polls show one party within striking distance of an outright majority, Alternative for Germany, or AfD. Across town, an American named Andrea is opening a very different kind of email. She moved to Halle 8 years ago after marrying a German, and now runs a small consulting business connecting local manufacturers with buyers in the US. One of her longest clients just wrote to say they're pausing a supply contract. Not because the numbers changed, but because their board wants to wait and see what happens with the election before committing more money to the region. Same city, same election, 2 completely different reactions. One voting out of frustration, one watching her business absorb the consequences of other people's uncertainty before a single vote is even cast. So, what's actually true here? What can a state election in Germany really put in motion, and what does it cost the people voting and the people just trying to live and work there? Hi, I'm Justin, and I've lived in Germany for over 12 years. This is The Price of Germany, where we break down the real numbers behind life here, the costs nobody puts on a postcard. This time, the cost isn't a grocery bill, it's a political one. If that's useful to you, subscribe, because we're walking through this with a level head, not a hot take. Here's the myth going around, on both sides, that a state election like this one is basically symbolic, or that if AfD wins big this fall, Germany wakes up the next day with a different currency and closed borders. Neither is true. What actually changes and what doesn't comes down to a detail most coverage skips entirely: what a state government in Germany can and can't actually do. Before we get into that, it's worth being honest about why AfD is polling where it is, above 40% in Saxony-Anhalt in several 2026 polls, within reach of a majority on its own. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The former East German states have real grievances, wages that still lag the West more than 3 decades after reunification, an industrial base battered by years of high energy costs, and a sense, not unfounded, that Berlin's mainstream parties show up every 4 years and disappear. Immigration is a genuine flashpoint too, not just online noise. A lot of people voting AfD aren't voting for a manifesto line by line, they're voting against feeling ignored. Pretending it's all fringe doesn't explain 40% of anything. So here's what's actually on the ballot. Saxony-Anhalt votes this September, alongside Berlin and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and Baden-Württemberg in the West already went to the polls back in March. In Saxony-Anhalt specifically, AfD isn't just leading. Multiple 2026 polls put the party in the low to mid-40s, which would make it the first German state where AfD could plausibly govern outright rather than sit as the largest opposition bloc. If that happens, a state government gets to do more than people assume. States run the police, control school curriculum and university funding, oversee cultural and media institutions, and staff a large share of the regional civil service. A state's governor also gets a vote in the federal council, which has to sign off on much national legislation. That's real, day-to-day authority, not decoration. Here's what gets lost in the headlines though. A state government cannot, on its own, pull Germany out of the EU, drop the euro, or rewrite national immigration law. Those are federal and EU level powers, locked into the constitution, and changing them would take control of the national parliament. Almost certainly a coalition partner, and in some cases, negotiation with 26 other EU countries. Saxony-Anhalt's election by itself doesn't touch any of that directly, but it's worth knowing what AfD says it wants if it ever holds that level of power, because that trajectory is part of what this vote is really about. Nationally, the party has called for deep tax cuts, scrapping the wealth and inheritance tax, tightening asylum law well past what current German courts allow, and most dramatically, a negotiated exit from the EU, sometimes called Dexit, including dropping the euro for a revived Deutsche Mark. That last one is where the real price tag shows up. Independent economists, not campaign staffers, have run the numbers on a euro exit. Berenberg Bank's chief economist estimates it could cost Germany more than 10% of its economic output over a decade. An economist at ING called it, bluntly, the kind of shock that could trigger a full-blown financial crisis. Researchers at the DIW Berlin Institute have warned it would put millions of jobs at risk. These are projections, not facts on the ground. and estimates vary, but 3 independent institutions landing in the same neighborhood is not nothing. For a real-world comparison instead of a hypothetical, look at Brexit. The UK's own independent budget office estimated that leaving the EU would shrink long-run output by roughly 4%, and trade with Europe has measurably dropped since. That's a country that only left the trade bloc, not the currency. Leaving the euro, far more tightly wired into Germany's economy, would be a bigger structural change than what Britain went through. Here's where it gets interesting, and it's what actually happened to Andrea's contract. Businesses don't wait for a policy to pass before reacting to it. They price in the risk the moment it becomes plausible. That's happening in parts of Eastern Germany right now. Investors and partner companies quietly slowing deals. Not because Dexit happened, but because it's now a real enough possibility to show up in a risk assessment. The cost isn't waiting for election night. For some businesses, it's already being paid. If you've got property or a business with any exposure to Germany right now, that kind of political uncertainty is exactly why having the right coverage in place actually matters. I'll drop a link below to AXA, the insurance provider I'd actually point Americans here toward, so your assets are protected instead of exposed while the headlines sort themselves out. So, back to Halle. Torsten's vote this September genuinely does control who runs the police, the schools, and a chunk of the civil service where he lives, and it hands his state's governor a seat at the federal table. That part is real and immediate. What it doesn't do, by itself, is bring back the Deutsche Mark or shut the border overnight. Andrea's situation is different and in some ways more immediate. Her client isn't reacting to a law that passed, they're reacting to uncertainty itself, and that bill is already on the table no matter how September turns out. So if you want to actually understand what's at stake instead of just reacting to headlines, first, figure out exactly what office is on your ballot and what it legally controls, because a state election and a federal election aren't the same vote with different math. Second, read the party's actual platform, not the clip making the rounds online. Third, if your money or business touches Germany, watch the specific federal and EU level developments that would actually move markets, not every regional poll. And fourth, when you see a dramatic economic figure thrown around by any party about any policy, check whether it's coming from one source or several independent ones landing in the same range, the way the Dexit estimates do. Torsten still hasn't decided how he's voting, and honestly, that's fine. It's his call to make with real information instead of slogans. Andrea, meanwhile, is already rewriting her quarterly forecast because sometimes the most expensive thing on a German ballot isn't even what wins. Whatever happens this September, that's the kind of cost that never makes it onto a postcard. If you want more of these breakdowns, the real numbers behind life in Germany, not the tourist version, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.